Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas tardes, y buenas noches. We're supposed to be doing it the other way around. It's video too, so it is bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, buongiorno, buonasera, dzień dobry, dobry wieczór, i jak jela, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, wherever you may be. Video two of the day, because the first one was the Sunday roast of that vile creature, Melissa. Melissa O2G3Y, the 1 month old account, fake Melissa. Yeah, that was video one. Video two is the telephone saga part two, because, of course, there is a very important moment regarding Jay Slater's phone activity that we need to look at. And so, chosen background of the day is, if I get my fat head out of the way, this baffling last piece of activity on Jay's phone, as claimed by Debbie Duncan, where we have the words, it's a snap, a message via Snapchat, listen, comma, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make it. Listen, I'm not going to make it. Now, this is important because we do have a very telling contradiction here in the Jay Slater narrative, and it is most definitely a hurdle that the accident group cannot explain, and Debbie can't explain. No one can explain it. Here is the contradiction. On the one hand, sworn testimony under oath, DCI Higson, Lancashire Police, told us in the inquiry, or the inquest, coroner's inquest, that without any shadow of a doubt whatsoever, there was no further activity on Jay Slater's phone after it cut off and died at 8:51 a.m. on that fateful Monday morning. That's it. No more activity. And remember, DCI Higson was charged with looking into all activity on Jay Slater's phone for the time span June 16th to June 18th. So we can't say that DCI Higson, after the phone cut off, didn't look at anything else. DCI Higson did, and saw there was no further phone activity after 8:51 a.m. on that Monday morning. End of. And yet, in stark contrast to that, and inexplicable to the whole world, is Debbie Duncan saying that DCI Higson got that wrong. That this snap was sent, or rather was drafted, it was written, and not sent, from Jay to Brad. Listen, I am not going to make it. Now, how to explain that? It can't be explained. It can't be explained. But I want to go into a grey area here where certain people, mainly accident group, have got very, very confused about this. Because as a distraction, I believe, Debbie and others have put out there that this message, this last message, is entirely possible because even though it was written and sent, it never reached Brad because Jay's phone was off. It died. And that it is entirely possible when the Spanish police gave that phone back to Debbie, when she charged up the battery and connected to Wi-Fi with the signal there, that message there did then eventually go from written draft to being sent and went to Brad's phone. Brad read it and asked Debbie straight away, are you using Jay's phone? which actually is a little bit strange in itself. I mean, I would have thought once Brad had received that, he would have been in such shock. I'm not sure he would have gone straight to Debbie and said, are you using Jay's phone? I don't know. I'd have been so freaked out, like, who is using Jay's phone? How did this happen? I'm not sure I would have contacted Debbie straight away, but that's a different matter. It's a different matter. It doesn't really affect anything. But the crux of this important point is that so many people have said, oh, yeah, that's possible that this message could have been sent. Of course, it could have been sent after Jay's phone, several months after Spanish police, or several months after Jay died. It's possible this message could have been sent and arrived on Brad's telephone. That's not the point. The point is, after Jay's phone is dead, there is no way that Jay can then turn that phone on again and have battery power, connect to Snapchat, write this, press send, and then the phone die a second time. That is what is not possible. So focus on Jay's phone activity part 2 is actually the most important part. It is yet another mystery that unless it is clearly explained, we're stuck with the notion that something isn't adding up here. I'll say it one more time. This message cannot even be written without Jay's phone being turned on again after 8:51 a.m. when DCI Higgson says the phone was dead. So how to explain this? I'll try to explain it. I think what has happened here, I'll just cut to the chase, is that Debbie's advisors, people like Chris Pennington and Ira Lovelace, have said to her that, look, we have a bit of a problem here because there is no evidence whatsoever, once Jay's phone cuts off, that he ever went down into that ravine. In fact, logically, Jay would have stayed exactly where he was by the road and waited for help. So, Debbie, here's the situation. We need some extra evidence. We need something else put out there to show that indeed Jay was blundering through that wilderness, that at some point Jay realized he wasn't going to be able to walk all the way back 11 hours to Los Cristianos, that his number was up. And therefore, Debbie, what we need is one last message to prove to the world that Jay was, in fact, wandering down that ravine, realized death was on his doorstep there, death was a knocking, and this is his final message. That's what we need, Debbie, just one more piece of evidence to push Jay further down that ravine. Otherwise, the world's going to see this makes no sense. And at that point, I would have thought, Debbie says to the slugtard, El Slugtardo, or Pumpkin, but hang on, if his phone is already dead, this can't happen. And I don't know if you remember this, but for the longest time, El Slugtardo, the slugster, kept saying, well, we don't know that his phone died by the road there. It could be that there was a little ping of life, just a little ping of life a little later on as he switched it on for a few seconds. And El Slugtardo kept saying, remember, Cipriano Martin said it pinged in all 4 ravines. So surely, I believe, El Slugtardo told Debbie that you will get away with this because it is possible that phone just turned on one more time. Remember, El Slugtardo would be saying all this before the documentary came out and before the inquest. This was in the documentary. And the documentary was released after the inquest. So that is why we heard nothing about this in the inquest, because it surely would have contradicted what DCI Higgson said on the stand. That is why, I believe, Debbie stayed silent. When DCI Higgson said there was no phone activity after 8:51 a.m., and Debbie, knowing about this, was like, oh my God, how do I now explain what I said in the documentary? Stayed silent. But she should, of course, raised her hand and said, excuse me to interrupt, but what DCI Higson just said is not true. Debbie's silence at that moment tells me everything I need to know. That she knew, and this is why, just wait till the inquest was so true. This is why, and this is how we found out that we are being lied to. I'll say it one more time. Debbie Duncan knew about this message. It was going to come up in the documentary. But when DCI Higson contradicted the possibility of this message being written, Debbie had to be silent and just fingers crossed and hope for the best that no one, come the documentary, would spot that this message is absolutely 100% impossible. The other mistake I believe El Slugtardo and Debbie's advisors made was they thought everyone would focus on the idea that this message can't be sent. This message can't just arrive on Brad's phone months later. Surely, once the Spanish police have turned that phone on, then that message would get sent immediately to Brad. It wouldn't have to wait till Debbie showed it. And El Slugtardo figured a way to contradict that. And that is why El Slugtardo was very, very quick to say, no, that's entirely possible, because when the Spanish authorities scraped Jay's phone, they get all the data. The phone's in a Faraday cage. There is no signal to the phone. They basically obtain all the data without turning the phone on. Then it's entirely possible that this message then gets sent to Brad when Debbie turns the phone on. When El Slugtardo focused on the process of how this message gets sent months later, and how Brad receives it much later, and how the Spanish police never actually read this message because they never turned the phone on, they just scraped the data through the Faraday cage, it's all true. But the problem here is El Slugtardo thought this would be enough to explain how this message gets sent and how it's received by Brad months later. What El Slugtardo failed to understand, or failed to convince Debbie to understand, was two things. Number one, the Spanish police, even if they have placed Jay's device in a Faraday cage, which means all signal is blocked off, that they can digitally scrape the information. Yes, this is all true. If you have a Faraday cage, there's no evidence that Tenerife police do have one. But El Slugtardo, without any evidence, has said that's what they have. They have the means, they have the way to scrape all of the data, clone it effectively, and not turn on the phone. However, the problem with that is that's not what police forces do. What they do, even if they've used the Faraday cage and that technology to scrape the info, after they've got all that, it's safekeeping, they then have to turn that phone on for the simple reason that the police who are investigating that phone need to know what other communications may or may not have happened after the phone died. Of course, the police need to do that. As a thought experiment, just imagine, let's say that the last message Jay had written wasn't listen, I'm not going to make it. Let's imagine Jay's last message had been, listen, the name of the person who is trying to kill me right now is da, 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 da. Let's say his very last written message, his last snap, had been the name of the person who was pursuing him. Do you really think the Spanish police are going to risk not turning that phone on, not seeing what other subsequent communications come through on that phone, and just hand it back to Debbie and say, go ahead, turn it on, see what new messages might pop up? Do you really? No, obviously not. So standard practice for all police authorities, once they've looked into all the data in a device, is to then check any subsequent communication that might come through once that phone has been recharged and reconnected. There we go. That's it. So it is absolutely childish, but this is the Slugtardo, this is Ivor Lovelace's approach to try to explain things in a childish way. So when you hear him saying, well, yeah, the police could have scraped all that data. It's a Faraday cage, and that message could then go through months later to the brain. It's all true. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is, yes, but that wouldn't have happened. The police would have checked for this kind of message. The Spanish police. This would have been known about in November. When Debbie's handed that 600-page report and the phone comes back to her, this message would have been known to her immediately. The Spanish police would have told her. And that might have happened. This might be in that 600-page report. But I believe, it's my belief, I believe Debbie, on the really bad advice of the likes of Ivor Lovelace and Chris Pennington, decided to go ahead with this extra little bit of evidence to show the world that Jay did have one last message as he was approaching his moment of death in the ravine, and this is it. And it can't be, as I said, for two reasons. Number one, Spanish police would have come across this before handing that back to Debbie. And number two, this message cannot be written on a phone that has died. End of. DCI Higson either got it totally wrong, in which case all of that testimony in the inquest is null and void. New inquest, please. Yeah. Key testimony from DCI Higson is wrong. Or DCI Higson got it right. I would imagine so. And this, Debbie Duncan, is all fabricated. Otherwise, just explain it. How did it happen? All right. Mystery of that last snap. I believe some really, really bad advice came from those who claim to be searchers, but who I believe are covering something terrible up over there, given to Debbie. Debbie's thrown her lot with these clowns, and it's going to come back and bite her big time. Because this makes no sense whatsoever. All right. Jan's Views Live tonight. Could be interesting. Let's see what happens. Hasta luego. Adios.